Hello everyone, Inquisitor Vaughn here. A few years ago, I was invited to contribute to the lore of an AU, or an alternative universe version of Warhammer 30k, where the overall idea of the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy were the same, but the legions were completely different homebrew creations. I was invited to make one of the legions for this AU setting. I wrote something up and I submitted it, but unfortunately it was not accepted as part of the project. Still, I decided to hold on to the idea and work on possibly making it into a missing Primarch and missing Legion idea. After working on it little by little over the years, here is the finished project. Without further delay, let us begin. The gestation pod of the second Primarch landed on the nameless, cold, and barren moon that revolved around a world called Hoskaru. Hoskaru was what would later be called a paradise world. It was a planet of bizarre beauty. Its soil and surface terrain were a brilliant off-white, while the plants and trees were vastly multicolored pinks, purples, and silvers. The world's oceans were crystalline blue, and its clouds were a sunburst orange. The biosphere of Hoskaru was also particular. Animal life on the world seemed perpetually in a primordial state, as if life was constantly just beginning to form. Physical features were vegetal, uncertain, suggestive, and bound to change. There was a human population on Hoskaru, the descendants of a population of humanity that had settled on the world during the dark age of technology. Unlike so many other populations of humanity rediscovered during the Crusade, the people of Hoskaru lived long lives of relative peace and introspection, reaching old ages. The peoples of the world lived in harmony with their environment, considering themselves to be its caretakers, and were said to have spiritual practices centered around it. The second Primarch would know none of these things until much later in its life. Its gestation pod landed on Hoskaru's moon, which was unnamed, uninhabited, and which barely sustained life. The specific means to how he survived on a thin atmosphered, lifeless satellite planet are either unknown or unrecorded, but he survived, alone and isolated for decades before the Emperor would find him on his journey to relocate and recover his Primarch sons. The second Primarch did not have contact with actual humanity until after the Emperor discovered him upon Hoskaru's moon during the early Great Crusade. The Primarch did not know how to speak, but when the Emperor greeted him, he instantly understood the entire structure and form of High Gothic. The first words that the red-eyed Primarch ever spoke were to the Emperor in response to his greeting, and they were, "I understand." According to the reflections of the Primarch himself, the Emperor appeared to the second Primarch unarmored and instead in a heavy yellow cloak. The custodians that accompanied him were only partially armored, their arms and abdomen exposed, heavy capes on their shoulders, and their pointed helmets on their heads. When meeting the second Primarch, the Emperor's guardians were in their rarely seen ceremonial attire. It is said that the Emperor enjoyed the company of the second Primarch. Though his red eyes and pronounced canine teeth were shocking features, the Primarch was curious about his nature and the reality of the universe, and the Emperor was entertained by his analytical mind and philosophical depth. The Primarch talked extensively about what he called the celestial will of the universe, an ideology that he had somehow learned in his isolated life on the moon. He relished in his ability to communicate it and share it with another. To this, the Emperor would listen closely. Together, the Emperor and Adiphron would walk across the terrain of the otherwise lifeless moon, looking up at the immense multicolored surface of Hoskaru, engaged in conversation about the universe and reality. Some records say that the Primarch could actually see and watch the denizens of Hoskaru from the moon as if he were standing right above them, but this account cannot truly be confirmed. During their conversations, the Emperor revealed the second Primarch's name to him, and it was Adiphron. Adiphron's naming had a profound impact on the Primarch. In response to it, the Primarch would have several visions at once, which would nearly make him collapse. When he composed himself, his response to it was, "I understand." It was here that the Emperor would tell Adiphron of his purpose and place in the galaxy, of the Great Crusade and the effort of uniting humanity across the stars. Adiphron agreed to journey back to Terra, but stated that he would return to explore Hoskuru. The Emperor nodded in approval. Adiphron's genesis was distinctly marked by the fact that he grew to maturity alone and not surrounded by humanity or any form of life. The first other people that he met were the Emperor of Mankind, accompanied by his Legio Custodes. This is suggested to have had a negative impact on the Primarch to a certain degree. It is noted that when he first encountered regular humans that labored aboard the Emperor's flagship, he was disappointed in them and unimpressed. Adiphron would accompany the Emperor back to Terra in order to learn about the Imperium of Man and its ideals, while the scattered elements of the Second Legion were called back to Luna in order to meet their Primarch. On their way back to Terra, the Emperor's fleet was attacked by a fleet of Orc ships. During the conflict, Adiphron showed his analytical skills in combat, commanding the ships of the fleet to circle and flank the Orc flagship in a way that the Emperor had never seen before. It was under the direction of Adiphron that the Orc flagship was destroyed. Alpharius was the first Primarch to officially meet Adiphron under the guise of a regular Astarte on Terra in the Imperial Palace. Adiphron could immediately tell that Alpharius was a Primarch, but understood that he was being intentionally hidden and didn't mention it. Adiphron would also meet with Horus Lupercal, and though records of their interaction were unavailable, the second Primarch was deemed fit by Horus to lead his legion after Horus himself had been commanding them. Soon after, Adiphron was introduced to his legion, the Time Wardens, on Luna. The initial recruits of the Second Legion on Terra were taken from the techno-primitive population of the Caucasus Wastes that were under the control of the Ethnarchy. The Ethnarchy was one of the more difficult nation-states for the Emperor to defeat during the latter unification wars. Its territory was protected by powerful shield generators which stopped bombardment and aerial attacks. Its citizens were shaped by eugenics and gene crafting, with warriors similar to the Emperor's forces at the time called Urcasis. To help bring an end to this conflict, the Emperor utilized the 18th Legion, the Dragon Warriors, sending them deep into the earth in order to destroy the shield generators at their source. There, they would combat technological horrors in the subterranean Tempest galleries. Despite the high casualties to their number, the 18th Legion were successful, shutting off the massive generators and allowing the Emperor's forces to attack. When the Emperor's forces defeated the Ethnarchy, the youth of the population under its oligarchy were recruited as candidates for the Second Legion, before the net of recruitment was cast wider to include most of the populations on Terra. The candidates for the Second Legion were chosen for their display of higher than regular intelligence and their degree of pre-existing genetic manipulations, amongst other factors. The nature of the Emperor's genetic work on the Primarchs manifested itself in the Marines created from their gene seed. With some Primarchs, genetic information was added or subtracted, which made the Primarchs express different physical and mental qualities that ranged from human familiarity to bestial semblance. For the second Primarch, additional genetic material was added from human origin, in the form of chromosomal surplus and manipulation. The result of these modifications significantly increased the intelligence of the Legionnaires imbued with the Second Legion's gene seed. The gene seed of the Second Legion was also transformative in a similar way to the Ninth Legion's gene seed, though different in a distinct way. While the gene seed of the Ninth Legion could transform physically mutated humans into Space Marines, the gene seed of the Second Legion was compatible with candidates who were far past the standard age of Astartes induction. The success rates of full transformation into an Astartes amongst the groups aged over 20 to 40 years of age were consistently positive, and there are records of candidates even older being inducted successfully. Lastly, the gene seed of the second Primarch physically reversed the age of the candidates to around the age of induction standard. The Second Legion's gene seed was basically a fountain of youth, imbued with what was called the Prime Helix. It is noted, however, that despite the red eyes and elaborate canine teeth of their Primarch, the Legionnaires of the Second Legion looked like standard Astartes with no visual defects. The Second Legion's first recorded campaign was in the small techno-barbarian city-state of Switzer, where they protected a cult of timekeepers who maintained vast records of Terra's history. The Second Legion, under the command of their Legion Master Cronus, protected the cult against the hordes of devolved mutants in the area called the Elohi. It was from this Guardian deployment that the Legion earned its first campaign badge, the Red Addition Operator or Plus symbol of the Switzer territories. It was also here that the Legion gained their earliest name, the Time Wardens. There are scattered records of the Second Legion being deployed in the latter unification campaigns of the Atlan Wastes and in Nord America as well. As the Great Crusade left Terra during the reclamation of the Sol System, the Second Legion would be heavily tied to Luna, Terra's moon. Initially serving as a support force to the Warborn, Imperial Fists, and Wolves of Terra legions during the first pacification of Luna, once the moon was secured, it was the Second Legion who would delve into the mysteries of the Selenar gene cults that lived on the moon. During the Dark Age of technology, the moon was an epicenter of genetic research and development. During the isolation and degradation of the Old Night, the scientific minds on Luna formed into cults centered around the mastery of genetic manipulation, viewing the practice with a sort of mystical reverence. Luna was an important part of the Emperor's plans for humanity, and after the first pacification, the Second Legion would delve into the knowledge of the gene cults. It was with the aid of the Second Legion that the Emperor was able to transform Luna into a subterranean factory for creating Astartes in a much faster way than he could on Terra. Though current edited records say that it was the Thousand Suns Legion to receive the first group of Space Marines made on Luna, in truth, it was the Second Legion who had earned that honor for developing the moon's subterranean facilities. More of the Second Legion's identity was defined by their contributions during the pacification of Luna. It is here that their Legion's color scheme would change from the standard Ceramite Storm Grey to the Legion having a white helmet and a white right arm representing the pale white color of the moon. It is here that the Legion was officially addressed as the Time Wardens by the Emperor himself. Though officially an unsanctioned practice, the Second Legion would adopt many of the occult symbols that the Selenar gene cults used, such as the symbol of genetic helix, the rod of medicinal command, and the entwined serpents of structural knowledge. The Second Legion, now officially the Time Wardens, would also adopt the practice of wearing grey robes over their armor, also a practice of the Selenar gene cults. The legionnaires of the Second Legion were naturally analytical, observing the workings of the world around them with a deep-rooted fascination. It appeared as if their minds filtered all things down to their basic components in terms of usefulness and transformative qualities. Of all the legions, they were the least warlike. However, when in war, their analytical skills and resourcefulness would contribute greatly to the success of the Imperial forces. Having been trained by the same Imperial drill masters that trained all of the other early legions, the Second specialized in the role of tactical support, primarily responsible for the retrieval of the wounded, apothecary application, and recovering of resources on the battlefield. The Second Legion put particular emphasis on the healing and regenerative skills and had a higher amount of apothecaries than most other legions, usually having one apothecary per squad. Among the Legion assets were hundreds of transport tanks and flyers, which assured that the Time Wardens could make it to where they needed to be on the battlefield in order to tend to the wounded. On Terra, during the latter unification, the legionnaires of the Second tended to the human forces of the Emperor's armies with equal fervor and skill that they did with Astartes, and this is a practice that would continue as the Great Crusade expanded. When the Second Legion took up arms, it was usually in coordination with other Legion forces. It is recorded that they favored Volkite weaponry above all. Their tactical support squads were most frequently armed with Volkite chargers. Despoiler squads armed with Volkite Serpentas were particularly common in the Legion when it was under the command of the Primarch Horus Lupercal before meeting their own Primarch. Though elements of the Time Wardens would accompany the Imperial forces as the Emperor reclaimed the Sol System, the majority of the Legion would remain on Luna. After the Sol System was the Emperor's, detachments of the Second Legion accompanied the expeditionary fleets of the larger Astartes legions as they expanded outward into the galaxy to unify humanity and claim worlds for the Emperor of mankind. When their Primarch Adiphron was discovered and brought to Terra, the scattered elements of the Second Legion returned to Luna in order to meet their Primarch. Upon meeting his legion, Adiphron was filled with pride. While learning about the Imperium and the Astartes legions, Adiphron had notably seemed enthusiastic about the ability to transform regular humans into Astartes, and he looked upon the marines of the other legions with a curious eye. To be reunited with his own legion and to see Astartes of his own gene seed filled him with a new resolve. The legionnaires of the Second had encountered other Primarchs before and were not awed by their Primarch's existence. However, they had an undeniable tie and relation to him. A part of the Legion's spirit was completed upon meeting their Primarch, and so it was the other way around for Adiphron. Legion command was formally bestowed to the Primarch Adiphron from the Terran Legion Master, Cronus. Under the Primarch's direction, the Second Legion was renamed the Celestant Legion, after what their Primarch referred to as the celestial will of the universe. The color scheme of the Second Legion would change from storm gray and white to a bright, almost chrome-like silver. Their heraldry would become a winged genetic helix on a field of white. Adiphron himself would wear a chrome-colored Mark II-inspired suit of Primarch armor called the Mercury. It featured the symbols of his legion, including many symbols from the Selenar gene cults that his legion had adopted as their own. His monovisor helmet had small chrome wings near its ears that pointed backwards. Each of his sabatons was a head and beak of a silver eagle, and both ankles had chrome wings on them. Though this was the armor that Adiphron was most frequently seen in, it is rumored that as the crusade progressed, Adiphron would have a second suit of armor made for him called the Armor of Oceanus, but he was rarely seen wearing this. Though the Legion would have a massive Gloriana-class flagship called the Metropolis, Adiphron personally preferred a relic ship from the Dark Age of technology, a massive Aquila-class void ship whose remains were docked on the orbital shipyards of the moon when it was reclaimed. It was an expedition ship built for space exploration, created soon after the development of faster-than-light technology and made using STC generators guided by thinking machines. It did not have a name when he claimed it, but Adiphron would have it repaired and updated, and he would call it the Nautilus. For the auxilia troops that would support the newly named Celestant Legion, Adiphron preferred the genetically modified soldiers of the Strife Epoch regiments that the Emperor created near the end of the Unification Wars. These small experimental regiments, such as the Switzer Voidbound, the Yorkin Elite, and the Burmu Vanishers, were specifically created for survival in the void of space. It is noted, however, that as the Celestant Legion embarked upon the Great Crusade, these auxilia regiments were never seen again. Records indicated that the Legion grew in numbers sharply before the Legion would reach the first world that they would liberate during the Crusade, yet there exist no records of where the new Astartes numbers were taken from, only that they were all Terran. Further records would indicate that the fleet ships of the Second Legion had no humans aboard them, and were crewed solely by Astartes. Adiphron's first destination would be to Haskuru, as he said he would return to. When the chrome-armored Primarch and his Astartes landed on the world, the Haskuruan peoples were fascinated by them. It is said that Adiphron regarded them as he regarded all regular humans, pitifully, but that the world itself and its biosphere had fascinated him. It was from the Haskuruan peoples that he would be given the name Hursel, which meant of the stars in the local dialect. They also created for him a trident-shaped staff of rulership, which he would have modified and he would carry with him for the rest of the crusade. The gene seed of the second Primarch had another unknown ability that was not hidden from the Emperor, but simply unexplored due to tradition and expectation. The gene seed of the second Primarch could transform any human into an Astarte, regardless of if the aspirant was older than standard and regardless of their gender. This had always been the ability of the Second Legion's gene seed specifically, but it was an ability that the Emperor was unaware of as he demanded that all Astartes be male. But Adiphron's gene seed was just as neutral as he was and could be implanted into any standard human with success. Adiphron himself discovered this when he returned to Haskuru. Without ever truly knowing the nature of his gene seed, he considered it a waste of half of the available population of humanity if 100% of humanity couldn't be ascended into Astartes. When he ordered the full induction of the world's population into the Legion, he didn't know that his gene seed would be successful amongst both genders of the species as well. It was in this way that the Celestant Legion was able to induct nearly the entire population of the planet Hoskaru into the Second Legion. Rather than mix the Hoskaruan legionnaires into the Terran legionnaires that accompanied him, Adiphron would make the legionnaires on Hoskaru their own chapter, the first chapter of the Second Legion created during the Great Crusade. They were referred to as the Trident Chapter, and they were tasked with making the system that their planet existed in into an oasis for humanity. Adiphron and the Celestant Legion would move on from Hoskaru, visiting world after world in system after system on which humanity had settled and survived, bringing to them the gift of the Prime Helix, transforming entire worlds into Astartes. While it began as one of the smallest legions on Terra, the numbers of the Second Legion swelled during the Great Crusade. The rapid rate of induction from a variety of worlds led to the creation of several chapters of the Celestant Legion, many of whom were stationed in the systems in which they were created. Independent and autonomous of each other, each chapter was given the resources necessary to sustain themselves and continue the growth of the Legion in their system. These chapters varied in color scheme and even heraldry, but all bore some variation of the ancient symbol of the Legion standing under the banner of the Celestant. Once a chapter of the Second Legion was established, the standard humans in that system were gradually transformed into Astartes. Most populations were not against this, seeing Adiphron and the Celestant Legion as their saviors, bringing strength and technology to them like Prometheus bringing fire to mortals from the gods. But there were human civilizations that resisted incorporation into the Second Legion. They would feel the wrath of Adiphron, and he did not permit any survivors. The Emperor had full faith in the Primarchs, each leading their own expeditionary fleets, and left them to their own devices without micromanagement. While the Emperor was continuing his quest across the stars to reunite humanity, Adiphron was unraveling the first ever act of heresy. Adiphron actively disagreed with the goals of the Great Crusade. Unlike the other Primarchs who initially were in compliance with the goals of the Great Crusade, Adiphron had been against them since the beginning. Urged forward by his understanding of what he called the celestial will of the universe, Adiphron saw his purpose as being more than what the Emperor described to him. Adiphron thought of humanity's fate beyond that of constant war with the life around it. While the second Primarch swore loyalty to the Emperor, in his heart of hearts it was only to gain access to the materials he needed to enact the celestial will. Through his isolated upbringing, Adiphron understood the universe as a cold and indifferent place that did not care about life, but awarded survival with continued life. That was the celestial will, survival, and Adiphron thought himself responsible for the survival of the human species. As it was, humanity was still weak. Almost every other species that existed in the galaxy was stronger and more physically built to survive the harsh nature of the universe. But what humanity lacked in physical strength, it made up for in intelligence. With intelligence, humanity created science, and with science, humanity created wonders. His very existence as a Primarch was proof of this. To Adiphron, it would be through science that he would save the human species. The Emperor had shown Adiphron a means to doing so through the creation of the Adeptus Astartes, descended from his own genetic line. With an enhanced skeleton and musculature, 3 lungs and 2 hearts, extended lifespans, and the ability to endure, the Astartes were built for survival. The technology and the armor that they had were perfect tools for stellar exploration and endurance in space, as well as on a variety of terrestrial environments. But to Adiphron, Astartes were wasted in war, created to fight and face often pointless demise through unnecessary conflict for the sake of unifying humanity. Adiphron Hursel would choose another way. The objective of the Celestant Legion was not war on behalf of the Great Crusade, but salvation on behalf of humanity. The Second Legion would transform as much of humanity into Adeptus Astartes as possible, not for war, but for survival. The various chapters of the Legion would serve as the future civilizations of humanity. The human species would become the masters of this galaxy. The world of the Celestant Legion and its many chapters were not engines of production for the Great Crusade, but places of diverse civilization where the Astartes would study the arts and sciences, where they would create and explore. They were utopias in a galaxy strife with war. In almost sharp contrast to this hope for humanity's future, Adiphron despised abhumans. He considered them the failed dregs of humanity, and the Celestant Legion would conduct several cleanses to the various subspecies of abhumans that had either evolved or were intentionally created during the Age of Strife. The cleansing of Dado was one such example of the Second Legion's hate of the abhuman. Dado was a high-gravity prison world that was established near the end of the Dark Age of technology. When the cybernetic revolt occurred, the technology that kept the prison's facilities on fell into disrepair. The prisoner populations would escape their enclosures, slaughter their jailers, and soon turn upon each other. The combination of the high-gravity environmental conditions and the necessary violence of survival on the world slowly, over the span of the Age of Strife, devolved the human population of the world into what would later be called Oghren, 10-foot-tall monstrosities of mankind, covered in thick skin and hard muscle, possessed of significantly reduced intelligence and violent impulse. Adiphron looked at the population and saw them as errors of evolution. The Celestant Legion would land on Dado alongside the Dark Angel's Legion, slaughtering the entire population. Unlike the other legions, the Celestant Legion only fought against xenospecies if it was absolutely necessary. Rather than immediately commit to Annihilation Protocol, Adiphron would determine if there was a standard of coexistence with every species that the Legion encountered, and every chapter of the Celestant Legion operated under this perspective. If coexistence was not possible, only then would the Second Legion annihilate the species with a storm of Volkite fire. There was one species that the Second Legion fought with unrelenting aggression, and it was the Orcs, because they were seen to be the greatest threat to the survival of humanity. However, it was his comparatively lenient approach toward the existence of Xenos that would lead Adiphron to interacting with the Eldari species. The Celestant Legion discovered a string of Exodite homeworlds called Maiden Worlds in the Ultima Segmentum. It was on the Maiden World of Nasan that the second Primarch met with the Exodite leader, Concorsa. Through him, Adiphron was informed of the ancient past of the galaxy, millions of years before humanity ever existed. He learned the truth of the Orcs, that they were a bioengineered creation of war against a slumbering enemy spread throughout the galaxy. Last but not least, he was told of the Old Ones, the primordial creators of life in the galaxy. On hearing where the Old Ones once resided in the galaxy, Adiphron would devise a plan. The Primarch split his legion in two. The Metropolis, in one half of the Legion, with all of its chapters, would be under the command of First Captain Sophia. The Nautilus, the rest of the Terran Celestants, and the Primarch himself would head north to find the proverbial garden world where life began in the galaxy. First Captain Sophia and the forces under him would continue the work of the Legion, transforming populations into Astartes and seemingly continuing the Great Crusade besides the other legions. However, Adiphron would not be following the directives of the Great Crusade at all. Instead, he would journey secretly to the northwestern region of the galaxy in search of the Old Ones. Though Adiphron and his portion of the Legion would come into conflict with a powerful machine-based enemy on the way to his destination, his plans were ultimately thwarted by the demands of the Great Crusade. By this time, the Emperor and his legions were embroiled in the Ragdan genocides taking place in the halo stars of the northwest portion of the galaxy. The Emperor commanded that Adiphron and his legion join in the effort against the predatory Ragda species, and initially, Adiphron refused. The Primarch would eventually be convinced into participation, but his initial refusal spurred the Emperor to look into the affairs of the Second Legion. The Emperor deployed the Ghost Legion, the 20th, to infiltrate and investigate the Celestant Legion. When information got back to the Emperor about what was discovered on Hoskaru, the domain of the Trident Chapter and other worlds claimed by the Second Legion, he was simultaneously horrified and infuriated at what was found. It had been discovered that not only had gene seed from other legions been stolen and harvested, but the Celestant Legion had manipulated and experimented with those gene seed organs, combining them to create chimeric strains or otherwise modifying them to have different traits. Worst of all, evidence had been discovered on Hoskaru that Adiphron had commanded the creation of a permanent gene seed, which was in development, one that could be inherited by offspring genetically, rather than being imbued through surgical means. Adiphron was intending to make the Astartes the new evolution of humanity. Not only this, but he was intending to make his legion the only legion to exist. The Emperor ordered the arrest of Adiphron Hursel, and it would be the hidden Primarch Alpharius to conduct this arrest. Adiphron Hursel, Primarch of the Celestant Legion, was brought before the Emperor in chains. The trial was held in secret aboard the Bucephalus, the Emperor's own flagship. Only Constantin Valdor and Alpharius were present during this trial. Constantin Valdor started the proceeding, declaring that Adiphron was guilty of high treason against the Imperium of Man through consorting with Xenos species, theft of gene seed from other legions, and aspiring to usurp power from the Emperor of Mankind. Adiphron defended his actions as being driven by an all-consuming urge to save humanity and its future. He accused the Emperor of only assuring the species' demise through withholding his full ability to genetically modify humanity into a more higher form, as was evident in the creation of the Custodes and the Primarchs. Adiphron condemned the Emperor, saying that the survival of the human species was a celestial will, that he was made by the Emperor to be how he was, and that it was hypocrisy to condemn him for doing what he had been created to do. The Emperor, who had sat immobile and silent for most of the trial, would only say 2 words to Adiphron in response, and they were, "I understand." When these words were spoken, Adiphron's mind collapsed at the implication of what the Emperor stated. It was true that this was Adiphron's intended purpose. It was true that the Emperor was withholding his full genetic mastery from humanity. It was true that survival of the human species was the celestial will, not the celestial will of the universe, but instead the stellar, immortal will of the Emperor himself. The realization of this caused Adiphron to physically writhe in mental agony. The Emperor would speak no more during the trial, but watched the agony of Adiphron with cold indifference. It would be Valdor to declare Adiphron's punishment for his crimes, and that punishment would be exile. The second Primarch was taken to the easternmost rim of the Halo stars by the Legio Custodes and was sent from the Imperium of Man and this galaxy into the outer dark, forbidden to return again and mind-wiped so that he could not do so. Once Adiphron was banished from the Imperium, his legion became illegitimate. The Dark Angel's Dreadwing, commanded by Marduk Cedras, oversaw the complete destruction of entire solar systems where the various chapters of the Celestant Legion resided. The Space Wolves systematically hunted down and slaughtered the forces of the Second Legion that were engaged in the Ragdan genocides. This civil war, which was more of an eradication, was hidden underneath the Imperium's battle against the Ragda during the Third Ragdan genocides. After the Ragdan genocides, all records of the Second Legion and their Primarch were purged from the Imperial catalog, and it was as if they never existed at all. Worlds and aspirants previously claimed by the Celestant Legion were divided primarily amongst the Ultramarines and the Dark Angel Legions, while the Second Legion remaining gene reserves on Mars were destroyed. Statues of Adiphron and tributes to the Celestant Legion were all reduced to ash and rubble. The remaining Primarchs were forbidden to speak of Adiphron Hursel and were mind-locked against wanting to understand why. Adiphron and the Celestant Legion faded away from the Imperium, to never be remembered or recalled again during the Great Crusade. It is unknown as to why the Emperor spared the life of the second Primarch by condemning him to exile instead of execution. Since the Dark Age of technology, it had been a goal of the Emperor to accelerate the evolution of the human species from Homo sapiens to Homo superior, a perpetual species, but the Age of Strife delayed these plans. Perhaps, like the Thunder Warriors, the Emperor intended to create another type of genetically modified human after the Space Marines had accomplished the goal of the Great Crusade, but that too was thwarted by the Horus Heresy and the Age of Darkness. Adiphron represented that hope that the Emperor had for humanity's future. He embodied that hunger for the survival of the species, but he was that which the Emperor designed for a future that did not come to pass, as if created in the wrong place and at the wrong time. Perhaps this was the reason why Adiphron Hursel was exiled by the Emperor instead of destroyed. There were still many galaxies out in the universe. Surely, some of them were reached by humanity in the time of expansion, through chance or accident. If he survived, which was the second Primarch's prerogative, then he would go to them, the Emperor's gift to humanity, to the future that could have been, and could possibly be, elsewhere. The majority of the Second Legion was eliminated, all evidence of their existence wiped away. Still, small warbands of the Second Legion, conglomerates of the various chapters of the Legion, survived into the Horus Heresy, but were persistently hunted by the Space Wolves. Because Adiphron's gene seed was the only one that was compatible with the female of the human species as well as the male, female Astartes were direct indicators of Second Legion origin, and they were promptly slaughtered. Some legionnaires of the Second were able to hide amongst the other, more standard legions, while others resolved to fight in the heresy against the Emperor due to his decree toward their destruction. Overall, the Astartes of the Second Legion would not survive past the Horus Heresy. Still, Adiphron's legacy would survive into the 40th millennium. Due to the Sancprimus Portum containing the genetic information of all the Primarchs, including that of Adiphron Hursel, Space Marine chapters were made using the Second Legion's gene seed when the Archmagos Belisarius Call was given access to it. One of the chapters created using the Second Legion gene seed was a chapter called the Rainbow Warriors. In the Indomitus founding, more of Adiphron's children were created, but the information on their gene lineage was purposely hidden by the Archmagos. Though officially all information on the Celestant Legion was erased from Imperial record, the Emperor left a tribute to the Second Legion in plain sight for all to see and to know, even if not to fully understand. The white armor and the prime helix symbol of the apothecary role, the early color and symbols used by the Second Legion in its beginning.